I'm sure we will have a lot of questions, so was very informative. We now go to Professor Mohammad Fadel, who's joining us. Hello, are you Paul? Yes. Is it raining?
Yeah.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
My apologies.
That's okay. No problem. Sorry about the misunderstanding.
No problem. I hope I didn't miss important stuff.
Well, you missed two presentations, but we'll see.
Still hope.
Oh, still hope. We have two more.
So I could-
Well, yeah, you can sit here, or if you want to dry off first and then join us, it's fine. So we're going to go to Professor Mohammad Fadel next. He's joining us, I think, from Toronto. Professor Mohammad, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Can you hear me? I'm
Yes,
sorry.
Assalamu alaikum, and thank you for joining us. Thank you.
Yeah, I apologize for being a little late, the confusion about the timing and my post-op recovery, etc.
And yes, you had the surgery recently, so we really appreciate your being able to join us.
My pleasure.
So Mohammad Fadel is a professor of law at University of Toronto, I think, right?
Yes.
And a leading scholar of Islamic law and constitutional theory. Professor Fadel, you have between 10 and 15 minutes. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much. It's really my pleasure to be here. Before I launch into my comments, I just want to respond to one of the questions in the chat about that's asking what is Sharia. That the person was expecting to have some understanding of what that is. So let me just speak very briefly to that. So in classical Arabic, Sharia generally meant revealed law, and this was not a particularly this was not particular to the revealed law that Muslims follow. It was also used to describe the revealed law that Christians followed and Jews followed as well. And so there's a sort of a sense of divine dispensations over time, and the word to describe that was Sharia. In modern Arabic usage, Sharia is just generally used for law, generally speaking, right? Or qanun, etc. Now, in specifically Islamic jurisprudence, we talk about the aim of the Sharia is to understand the norms that God will judge us by. And so, according to Islamic jurisprudence, all human actions can be categorized into one of 5 different ethical categories: obligatory, prohibited, commendable, disfavored, or permitted. Like, i.e., there's no rule. And as a matter of just quantitative analysis, the most important category, moral category, is the permitted, right? So this is reflected in Islamic jurisprudence by the principle that there has to be specific proof in revelation to make an act something other than permitted, excuse me, either obligatory, commendable, disfavored, or prohibited. So that's the general ethical framework. Now, what my colleague, Professor Abul Fadl, was talking about in terms of the technical provisions of law, sort of what we as practicing lawyers, right, in the United States recognize as law, that is a very narrow subdivision of the Sharia. That's called fiqh. And that is a professional discipline. It's very technical, etc. But the Sharia, broadly speaking, is something what John Rawls, the American political philosopher, would call is a comprehensive doctrine, meaning that it seeks human flourishing in the fullest possible way in this life and the next life. So it's sort of, you could call it, broadly speaking, a divinely ordained way of living. But Islamic law is a very small part of that. Okay, so I hope that gives some of the people a broader idea of what the Sharia is. Now, a lot of my scholarship focuses specifically on questions of intersections between Islamic law, the Sharia, and democratic values. So it's not that this is an irrelevant question. There are lots of questions that Muslims debate intensely among themselves regarding the legitimacy of representative government, the legitimacy of things like constitutional rule, the legitimacy of gender equality, et cetera, et cetera. These are all perfectly fair questions to discuss. But as Professor Abul Fadl pointed out, I think rightly in his comments, is that on the right, these issues are raised not for the purpose of understanding, not for the purpose of internal reform, not for the purpose of constructive criticism, but for exclusionary purposes, right? So, for example, it's very trivial to look at any legal system whose existence is, 1,400 years and find rules that are repugnant to the sensibilities of a modern liberal citizen. That is not particularly the province of Islamic law. You could do the same thing for any religion that has a legal system, including Christianity and Judaism, obviously. So there are two ways to talk about this. First is from the internal perspective of a believing, practicing Muslim, right, who is also a liberal citizen. So for that person, it's a dilemma when that person comes across a historically established rule that doesn't seem consistent with his moral intuitions. That typically spurs attempts at reform. And we see that consistently in Islamic history, right? Secondly, is the external perspective. What does one do as a liberal citizen when one encounters another citizen with beliefs that seem on their surface to be incompatible with what one understands to be the requirements of good liberal citizenship? Well, Rawls again here speaks about something called a duty of restraint. What he means by that is there's a certain presumption of good faith. And that's implicit in the idea of religious freedom. If we accept religious freedom as a fundamental constitutional value, it flows from that, what I call the non-inquisitorial or the prohibition of inquisitions, right? So the Inquisition, what it tried to do is root out secret heresies. And once you are in the position of a defendant before the Inquisition, nothing you can say will satisfy your inquisitor, right? And that's exactly what happened in the Reconquista and in the Spanish Inquisition. Even after converting to Catholicism, Muslims will continue to be suspect in the eyes of the Inquisition. I recently taught a class on race and law and Islam in the Americas, and I was shocked to discover the Inquisition continued to practice its dark arts in the New World until the 18th century. There were still hunting secret crypto Muslims in New Spain as late as the 18th century, right? And so the anti-Sharia movement is really a continuation of a kind of inquisition of what's in people's beliefs. And it's fundamentally incompatible with the premises of liberal democracy, where we take people at their word, and we only interfere when conduct happens that is contrary to public law, right? So that's sort of what I would call the proper response to religious difference in a liberal democracy. And this is something that's universal, right? I, as a Muslim, sometimes hear religious doctrines from certain kinds of Christians and certain kinds of Jews that I find to be, wow, really, really incompatible from the premises of a liberal democracy. But that doesn't give me a license somehow to exclude them from institutional life. The only thing that authorizes me to do that is if they acted in such a way as to interfere with the freedoms of other people. And I think that's the point that Professor Abdul Fadl insists on. And I'm sorry, Professor Ilya, I can't remember his last name, I apologize for that, also insisted on it implicitly. Now, there's one point of correction I wanted to make regarding Ilya's comments. Now, he noted that the founders expressly contemplated that Muslims would enjoy religious freedom, and he said that there were very few Muslims at the time of the founding. I would like to qualify that by saying there were very few free Muslims at the time. There was, however, a very substantial number of enslaved Muslims, and it's probably clear that they did not enjoy much religious freedom at the time, and we sort of know this anecdotally through the little we know about the lives of slaves during the colonial era and during the founding era. And in this context, I really commend to everybody the book of our colleague Denise Spellberg, Thomas Jefferson's Quran. This is a very, very important book. Despite the title of the book, it's not simply about the fact that Thomas Jefferson had a Quran. It's really a deep dive about the place of Islam in colonial America and the founding, and among English-speaking Protestants more broadly. And I think what's very interesting from that book is that she shows that the place of Islam in the political culture of English-speaking Protestants has always been a marker, a deep sort of identitarian marker of division within English-speaking Protestants. So on the one hand, you have a group of English-speaking Protestants that you could describe as rationalists, Enlightenment, Islamophiles. And then you had on the other side of the divide a more, for lack of a better term, fundamentalist, textualist Protestant orientation that viewed Islam and Muslims as the quintessential other and that could never be incorporated into the polity. In fact, I was surprised to find out that Cotton Mather regularly gave sermons about the evils of Islam in the 17th and 18th century. I say surprised because, I don't think there were lots of free Muslims in the Puritan colony of Massachusetts, yet it occupied a disproportional place in his religious rhetoric. And I think it's important for us to begin to think about why that is the case. And these are like some really more profound issues in the history of religion that sort of go beyond, I think, the agenda of this panel. But suffice it to say that there are certain readings of the Bible in which certain groups are excluded from the divine covenant, right? And Arabs and Muslims are a sort of exemplary, or what I say, are the paradigmatic example of such a community that are excluded from the divine covenant. So you see, for example, theological writings in which Ishmael is described as a child of the flesh. His followers are slaves because of their obedience to the law, etc., etc. And so there is a deep tradition in Christian theology of constructing Muslims as the descendants of Ismail, as those who have been banished from the divine covenant. And so I think this is part of the sort of unspoken culture in which this anti-Islam is so resonant among certain sectors of the American society. It's not, as Khalid Abou-El-Fadl, some sort of rational fear, but rather it goes to the identity, the religious identity of many Protestant groups, that Islam is this ever omnipresent threat, even in the absence of Muslims, right? Like I said, Cotton Mather seemed to have a focus on the threat of Islam, despite no palpable Muslim presence in among the Puritans, right? Because Muslims play a symbolic role that go much beyond their actual empirical importance. And if we are going to deal with this kind of anti-Sharia movement, I think we have to really begin to talk about that more openly. It's not simply irrational racism. I think there are deep theological roots to this kind of discourse. Finally, I would like to conclude just by reemphasizing what my two previous speakers already said, that to the extent that there are particular rules in Islamic law that are incompatible with American law, right? There is no problem, because there are lots of groups and actions that take place every single day in the United States that are incompatible with American law. That's why we have something called judicial review. Congress passes laws that are struck down as unconstitutional, right? There is an ordinary course remedy for all sorts of things. Now, in our private lives, we are not subject to the Constitution, and Muslims should be just as free as everybody else to exercise rights of association, rights of religious worship, rights to enter into private contracts, right? Without regard to having constitutional norms apply to their transactions specifically, right? Now, if we want to talk about passing law that constitutionalizes every act in the private sphere, we can do that, but it can't be limited to one group and not others. So I will stop here and pass the mic back to Redwan. Thank you.